the critter we're going to be talking about, but it's getting there, especially this weekend. So this is the title. The subtitle could also have been From Freezing Forests to Freezing Astronauts, because that's essentially what we're talking about today, is suspended animation. So it's something a little bit over the horizon, but something to consider given the task ahead for getting us to Mars. So we're going to get through this slide first, and then the introductory slide. Sorry, I skipped that one there. Right. So as you heard, I teach at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and I teach space operations. So that includes courses like life support systems, the space shuttle, the International Space Station, and space operations itself. And I've been doing that for 10 years. And a tradition at the beginning of every semester with every course is asking the students to introduce themselves and to tell everybody what their favorite science fiction movie is. So the reason for that is because I like science fiction, and also science fiction is inspirational, and it has a habit of becoming fact. So for example, printing, bioprinting. Some students mention The Fifth Element. That was a movie 30 years ago where they printed out a human. It might sound like science fiction. Okay, we can't print out humans right now, but we've been printing out body parts for nearly 2 decades. And on the space station, we have a biofabrication facility that is printing out body parts and has been printing out body parts for close to 7 or 8 years now. That's science fiction becoming fact. Think of Alien, Avatar, Pandorum, Interstellar. All those movies feature hibernation, which sounds like science fiction, but we have that in medicine already called therapeutic hypothermia, where we can actually have patients in a state of hibernation. And of course, as you'd imagine, when we ask students for their favorite science fiction movie, The Martian is a favorite. And that is science fiction right now because we haven't yet sent astronauts to Mars. And the reason for that is because Mars is not just a rocket problem, it's also a biology problem. And the reason for that is because Mars is a long, long way away. And when you spend a long time getting to somewhere, bad things happen to the body. The body deteriorates, and after 6 months on space station, that's a typical increment for an astronaut, this is what happens. They have lost an awful lot of muscle mass. We'll look at some of the systems in a moment, but fortunately, when they return, they have a recovery crew waiting for them. They have flight surgeons. They have the search and rescue team ready on standby. As far as we know, these people are not waiting for you on Mars. So the Mars people who say we can go to Mars today are partly correct because a transit to Mars takes about 6 months, which is about as long as it takes to, about as long as a NASA increment on the space station. But the thing is, when you get to Mars, you have to be able to work. And you'll be there for several more months, during which you'll be deteriorating further, and then you have to make your way back, which is another 6 months. So you're going to be away for the best part of 2.5 years. And the longest cumulative spaceflight experience we have is Kononenko, which is just over 1,000 days. That's just one person. So the reason we have to look at this frog, which we'll get to in a moment, is because there are so many systems that are affected in long-duration spaceflight. You've got the muscle system. In space, in 6 months on space station, astronauts will lose around 20% of their muscle mass. And it takes about 90 days for them to recover that. The skeletal system, because of the absence of load, astronauts are losing about 1% of their bone mineral density per month. And to put that into context, that's about 10 times the rate at which somebody who is diagnosed with osteoporosis loses bone. And it takes them about 3 to 4 years to recover that bone when they get back. The cardiovascular system. So in the absence of gravity, you get a headward fluid shift of around 1.5 to 2 liters. And that causes havoc. It causes eye problems. About 20% of astronauts have vision problems. It causes diuresis because the body senses extra pressure in the chest, and it wants to get rid of that pressure. And of course, to do that, it has to get rid of the fluid. And then you have problems with the radiation. So when you go to NASA's Human Research Program, this is top of the list when it comes to risks, because radiation is sometimes called a mission killer. That's not me, that's NASA. There are 2 types of radiation. There's the radiation that exists or is generated from inside the solar system. That's about 99% of the radiation. And then the remaining 1% is galactic cosmic rays. And about 3% of that 1% causes 99% of the damage. It's catastrophic. It's almost impossible to shield against. Now, fortunately, the astronauts on the space station because the space station orbits at such a low altitude, at about 414 to 420 kilometers, it's in the thermosphere, and there's another atmosphere layer above that called the exosphere, and so they're protected from the worst of the worst radiation. Now, to put this into context, here on Earth, we are subjected or exposed to around 3 millisieverts per year. An astronaut on a space station in 6 months will be exposed to 75 millisieverts in 6 months. And going to Mars, you'd be exposed to 466. And remember, you have to still spend time on the surface, and then you get another 466 exposure on the way back. That exceeds the NASA career limit, because the NASA career limit for radiation exposure is 600 millisieverts. So there's a way to go before you can actually safely go to Mars as a NASA astronaut and be within those career limits. So how do we preserve physiology on the way to Mars? Well, this is one extreme possibility. It's an Alaskan wood frog. And what this amphibian does, and it's the only amphibian that lives up in the far latitudes, the high latitudes in Alaska, it freezes itself. So it's like an extreme form of hibernation, like hibernation on steroids, if you like. And we'll get to the processes of how it does this shortly. But that's essentially what it does. At the beginning of the season, it will freeze itself to about 60 to 65% of its body will be frozen solid. Its heart stops. It stops breathing. It is essentially almost clinically dead. And for those of you who like the Latin names, then that's what it's known as, the Rana sylvatica. And it does this with a 100% success rate. So it's not as if some of these frogs die when they try and revive themselves. It is a masterclass of hibernation in terms of what this frog can do. And there are lots of processes which are still not fully understood, but essentially it relies on a special type of biological antifreeze. And the process I'll explain shortly, but there are other processes involved as well, which involve oxidative phosphorylation, and as you can see, special proteins that are involved to actually help the amphibian do what it does and not damage its internal organs or damage the cells inside. But that's essentially what it looks like when it's fully frozen. These frogs, just to give you an idea, they weigh about 3 ounces. They're pretty small, but they've evolved to such a degree that they can actually hibernate successfully for over half the year in Alaska. And the sort of temperatures we're talking about in the areas where they do this, about -9 to -18. The only other animal that can do this is the Siberian salamander that can freeze itself to -50. So the way it works then, if we were to freeze human tissue, we would freeze it and you'd get a lot of damage because you have ice crystals forming in the cells. And that's exactly what would happen to this frog if it did the same, but it doesn't. What it does at the beginning of the season, when it's above freezing during the day and below freezing during the night, it undergoes a series of freeze-thaw cycles. And in each freeze-thaw cycle, the liver pumps out a huge amount of glucose into the cells. And it does this 10 to 15 times. In every freeze-thaw cycle, more glucose is released into the cells. And what happens, the cells are hydrated, and that forms a protective barrier against the ice. So it's the cells that are actually hydrated and not frozen, and then everything around the cells is actually frozen. An analogy to this is hyperventilation. So if you've seen breath hold divers or free divers, those are the divers that take a big breath of air and then dive down to 100, 120, 150 meters or hold their breath for 8 or 9 minutes. They go through that hyperventilation. That's essentially what these Alaskan tree frogs do, but in terms of freeze-thaw cycles. And by doing that, by going through these successive freeze-thaw cycles, they prevent any internal damage to their organs or the cells. And because they can do that, they're essentially in a deep state of hibernation. They're not breathing, their heart isn't beating, and of course they don't rely on any consumables because they're not eating. When you apply this to space flight, it's a huge benefit because the mass penalty for consumables for an astronaut, when you add the oxygen, the water, and the food, is about 5 kilograms per crew member per day. So you have a 1,000-day mission to Mars, that's 5,000 kilograms that you have to take with you. Also, you have less burden on the life support system, all the subsystems, all the assemblies, all the components. You don't have to worry as much about the life support system function. So there's benefits there as well. And then in the spring, or when you get to your destination, you wake up. And again, the Alaskan wood frog has done this 100% with 100% success rate. So it's maybe worth looking at some of the processes to see if we can actually understand and apply some of these processes to spaceflight. This is one process we'd have to look at in terms of applying these freeze-thaw cycles. And so basically, the cryoprotectant, in this case, the biological antifreeze, is this glucose that's released from the liver. That's the first hurdle that we would have to look at. Then you'd have to look at the ice crystals. So it's all well and good freezing the person, or freezing, maybe getting down to freezing. It's the thawing that really does the damage. And we'll look at some cases where this has been done with humans, the freezing, not the thawing, and look at some of the problems which have to be addressed there. So the trick, well, it is a trick. It's an evolutionary trick that has been performed by the Alaskan wood frog. You may have heard of some humans being frozen. Alcor is a company in California which has been doing this for decades. And the people being frozen are frozen in the hope that many, many years in the future, the technology will exist to thaw them out. So they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars having themselves frozen in these cryovats. And if we can do that for a spacecraft, then again, we can reduce the burden on the life support system, and we can also reduce the consumables being taken. So we wouldn't do this in one big jump. What we would do is gradually reduce the temperature. So a parallel exists in medicine. It's called therapeutic hypothermia. So this has been around for decades. We can actually put people in a hypothermic state and thereby a hibernative state. So for example, patients who are critically ill or critically injured who can't undergo an operation, we can put them in therapeutic hypothermia. And the way that works, they have a transnasal cannula. A cooling mist is passed through the body, gradually reducing the temperature by about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. If you can do that, you reduce the metabolism by 50%. So we can do that successfully for about 2 weeks. And because we've been able to do that for so many years, NASA and the European Space Agency has taken interest in this and funded studies to the tune of millions of dollars to see if we can actually apply this to spacecraft. So SpaceWorks International, which is a company in Atlanta, performed studies developing hibernaculums, which are essentially hibernation pods for the crew. There have been no human studies related to astronauts yet. But basically, if you can start off at this level with the therapeutic hypothermia and maybe get the temperature down by 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, then you're approaching that potential hibernation, suspended animation state that the Alaskan wood frog has been able to achieve. There is also research done in organ preservation. So there's a huge shortage of organs worldwide. And one of the problems with organs is preservation. You can only keep an organ frozen or close to frozen for about 4 to 5 hours because of those problems that I mentioned before with the ice crystals forming inside the cells. And so there is research that is being applied to organ preservation that could possibly be applied to solving the suspended animation wood frog problem. So worth mentioning that. In terms of the engineering problems, then you have a smaller spacecraft because you don't have as many astronauts active during the mission. You don't have to pack as many consumables with you in terms of water, food, and everything else you need for the life support system. You're not getting as much muscle being lost or bone being lost. That will depend on how low metabolism you can actually achieve. If you're at 50% metabolism, you're losing 50% less bone, 50% less muscle. But of course, you're still losing muscle, you're still losing bone. So that's a problem that still has to be addressed. For muscle, it's fairly straightforward. You can use electrostimulation. So basically, you put these patches on the muscle, you apply a very small electric current, and you activate the muscles to contract. For bone, that is still a work in progress. And then obviously, you have the radiation damage as well. So actually being in a hibernative state actually confers upon you some radiation protection, which is obviously a bonus. So what has to be solved first? Well, there's the freeze-thaw cycling, trying to mimic what the Alaskan wood frog has been able to evolve, obviously over hundreds, if not thousands of years. There's also the atrophying problem of the muscles and the bone loss. We have to develop the cryopods. So we have some sort of insight into this thanks to Alcor and their cryovats, where they saw these humans who've been frozen for future generations. At some point, you're probably going to have to involve artificial intelligence to log over the life support systems. So this is something that NASA's pursuing right now for its Mars mission. Having said that, you do not want an autonomous AI, because we've learned from science fiction that AI have a habit of going rogue and killing the crew. So for those of you who've watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, HAL, that was not a nice AI. So you probably wouldn't want that, but you'd want some element of AI-driven life support. And the revival protocols, this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges. There are a lot of challenges, but this is a big one. So you'd probably have a caretaker crew. Because you don't have an autonomous AI, you'd have a caretaker crew where you have sleep-wake cycles. So most of the crew would be asleep or in hibernation, and then you have a caretaker crew, maybe 2 or 3 crew, just looking over things in case something went wrong. But when it came time to revive the crew, that's a problem, because if you're on a hibernation, you're essentially in a coma. And if you've seen patients coming out of comas, then it's not like you see in the movies. So if you've all seen the film Aliens, in one of the early scenes, the sergeant, Apone, he wakes up, sits bolt upright, puts a cigar in his mouth, he's ready to go. No, that is not what happens when you come out of a coma. They have special scales like the Glasgow Coma Scale, which they apply to patients coming out of comas. And it starts off with very, very simple tasks like touch your nose with your right index finger. And if you poke your left thumb into your ear, something's very wrong. Then once you've accomplished basic motor skills, it moves on to more complex tasks, like identifying an orange or a banana or something like that. And it goes on. This might go on for hours to actually revive somebody. So this is something that has to be worked on as well, not just the revival at the end of mission, at the destination, but if something was to go wrong, who would you revive first, and how quickly can you do that? So the to-do list, I mentioned some of these already. It's the ice crystal damage. That's what happens if you freeze human tissue now. And the reason it's so difficult is because you have multiple tissue compartments in your body. You have muscle tissue, you have bone tissue, you have fat tissue, you have nervous tissue, brain tissue. And all of these tissues freeze and thaw at different rates. So freezing is the easy part. But and the problem is, some parts of your body have multiple tissue compartments. So simple organs are like the bladder and kidney. They freeze and thaw pretty easily because they don't have many tissues. But complex organs like the liver have multiple tissue compartments that all freeze and thaw at different rates. So you could freeze a liver, but when you thaw it again, all those tissue compartments are going to thaw at different rates, and you have a whole mush. And you don't want an astronaut being mush when you thaw them out. So that's one of the problems, one of the challenges there when we talk about ice crystal damage and also the tissue compartments. The toxicity. So this biological antifreeze that the Alaskan wood frog has developed so very, very well over many, many years could be toxic to humans. And again, that's something that you have to look at as well. That's not good if you have a toxic biological antifreeze. The freezing injury, again, depending on how low or how low a hibernation temperature that you set, and then the brain function. So these Alaskan wood frogs, when they revive in the spring, they're up, ready to go, no signs of brain function. Now, when you look at the brain with billions and billions of neurons, and you subject that to freezing and then thaw it again, if you have only just a small fraction of those neurons misfiring, again, that's not a good mission scenario outcome. Right, so full disclosure here, this is Leonardo AI. This is what happens if you put a request in for a frog wearing a spacesuit on Mars. So I didn't quite get it right because of those planets in the background, but that's as good as I could get it. So the Alaskan wood frog did not fight winter, it adapted to it. And maybe that's something we have to do for Mars. So that's just the takeaway there. And having said that, I'll open it up for questions.